Hey Titans, this is Mordecai from GamerTitan.com. In this video, I'm going to be going over using the proper context in Core. So in Core, there are really two different types of main context. When you are creating something, an object, for example, and you put it in your game. So if we just go ahead and slap an object into the world here. So just by putting this into the world, if the ball, as an example, is just in the hierarchy, then this is considered normal context. And so normal context is able to be viewed by both the client and the server. Now, as a background, a client is the machine on whoever is playing your game. So their actual computer is the client, and the server is the actual game server that Core is running, and that's what's allowing it to be a multiplayer game. And so when you're creating games in Core, or really any game, I guess that's multiplayer, there's two different machines that you have to be aware of. And so there's some pros and cons to doing things one way versus another. So for example, by just putting this ball in the hierarchy, it's considered normal context and it's able to be viewed by both the client and the server. And so that means that both the client's machine can get information on this object and as well as the server. Now, with just the ball here, it's not networked. So what that means is once the game is running, the server, we can't do anything with the ball. We can't move it, we can't rescale it, we can't do anything. And the reason for that is because it's not networked. If we make it networked if we right click on it and click enable networking, then we've now turned the ball into normal context networked. And what normal context networked allows us to do is it allows us from the server to be able to move the ball around if we wanted, and all the clients, everyone in your game, would be able to see that the ball was actually moving. Now, the downside of doing this through networking is that if you do it with too many objects, then your game potentially could become laggy. And the reason for that is because, and I'm by no means an expert on networking, so if this is incorrect or not 100% true, I apologize. But from what I understand is there's a limit to, how much the server can internet usage or bandwidth that the server can be replicating to the various clients. And so in a Core game, currently the max player count is 16. And so if there's 16 players, the server is having to replicate any type of information across the internet essentially to all those various clients. And so if you have too many of these objects, that could really bottleneck the server and cause substantial networking lag. So that's why there's other types of context, and by understanding these other types of contexts, there's a lot of ways to do things. So for example, I'm in this project. It's one of our projects that we published several months ago called Hazard Pay. And one of the things in Hazard Pay is we have this ship. And so just to give you a demonstration real quick, if I go, I think it's this direction. Hang on a second. All right. So in the actual game, if we go ahead and press play here, we can see that there's this ship. And this ship is actually in what's called client context. So client context is only ran on the client. The server is unaware of it. And client context has a few pros. The pros is that there's no networking involved if you wanted to move an object because it's only running on the client. And for things moving, you're able to run at whatever frame rate that client is able to run at. I believe the cap, however, is 60 frames per second. So from moving objects on the client, you can see that it looks pretty smooth. Now, by doing preview mode, by the way, because in just simple preview mode, something else to be aware of is that the editor is running both the server and the client on the same machine. And so that's why sometimes when you create something that is just a normal networked context, it'll look really smooth in the editor, but when you go to play the game or use server preview, it could potentially look choppy. So just be aware of that when you simply use preview, that you're running both the client and the server on the same machine. And so it's really not, from what I understand, it's not really doing networking, and so therefore it'll look smooth regardless. But this ship, if we go all the way out here and we click it, we can see that this entire thing is in a client context. And so the downside of doing this is that because it's only registered on the client and it's not replicated to the server, meaning it can't replicate to other clients, is that while each client will see the ship moving smoothly, the downside is that the ship potentially and most likely will be in a different position on each client. So for example, maybe one client will see it in this location while another one sees it over here. And because it's spinning like this, that's something that you'll only want to use for, like, you know, visuals. If it matters that each client needs to see the exact same thing happening, then that's where you'll want to use networked context. But if it's just something visual, like atmospheric, which is exactly what this is, it doesn't really impact gameplay if the players see it in two different positions, and we wanted it to run smoothly and limit our networking, then that's why we have it in client context. Another thing that you'll almost always use client context for, if not always, is for UI. So for UI, because you want the UI to be individual for each client, you'll want all of your UI to be on the client. And so with client context, there is a few things. This will kind of go into other videos in the future explaining this, but there are ways to transmit data from the client to the server and from the server to the client, but there are a few restrictions with that as well. And so what that means is if for whatever reason we wanted one client to be able to trigger something that made all the other clients see the ship moving, even though it was in client context, that could be doable, but there are some limitations with that as well because of what we'd have to use for that. So really in game dev, it's really about managing all your various resources that you have at your disposal and then figuring out which ones are best. So the other context is server context. Now, I don't know if I have an exact example. I guess this. So server context really is used for server-side scripts. And so any type of game logic. So for example, if there's a script that is in charge of like managing team score or like killing or like the score or like when a player dies, all that will usually be on the server context. And so because it doesn't need to be ran on the client and you wouldn't really want that type of game logic ran on the client, you could go ahead and put it in server context. And what server context is really used for is securing your scripts and making sure that it only is on the server, and then when a player joins the game, it's not replicated to all the clients. So server context, like I said, so far what I've really used it for is mostly scripts. There are a few things that I do use server context for that may be helpful to some artists, I suppose. And so for example, if I put a ball in server context, let's go ahead and put it, actually let's go to the lobby state or area. If I can figure out where that is. Okay. So if I put the ball in server context and I put it right here in the lobby, and then if I go to multiplayer preview mode and I click play, let this spool up real quick. you'll see that the ball isn't actually showing up. And that's because, once again, it's only on the server. And so go ahead and close this out. You'll see that the ball is still there. And so what potential use case could this have? So if you're an artist or doing something that needs like markers. So for example, perhaps I wanted something to spawn here. And since the server is going to be the machine that's in charge of actually spawning in objects, I could put this ball and use it as a marker on the server. And what I could do in my script is get the world position of this ball and then spawn in whatever it was that I wanted to spawn in. And so when I'm in the editor, I could see this ball, but the players wouldn't actually be able to see it. So it basically would just be used as a visual representation of where you would want to spawn something else in. And of course, that other thing that you spawned in would need to be networked. That way it replicates properly to both the client and the server. So in terms of objects, that's really the only potential example that I have. I'm sure there's others that have done other stuff with using objects in server context. So finally, there's one other type of primary context. And so I guess I should put a few balls in the project. And so what I could do is the other type of context is static context. So if you remember the example that I was explaining earlier about you want to limit the amount of networked objects in your project, what static context is great for is it allows you to have a networked object. So if I enable networking, you'll see that the static context is networked, but the children of the static context are not. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to actually move the static context, which is the parent, and it counts as one networked property, or one networked object rather, sorry. But because we can move the static context, all the children move with it. And so what that means is if for whatever reason, kind of going back to the ship example, if for whatever reason we did need to make that ship be networked and replicated to all the clients in the same position, then what one option we could do is we could make the entire ship under static context. And instead of having, say, I don't know how many objects this ship is, it's quite a bit. So instead of having, say 20 or so networked objects for just this one ship, by having it all under static context, it would be considered one object that's networked. Now, the downside with that is that we can only move around the static object, meaning they all would have to move as a unit. They would all have to move as a group. We couldn't actually individually move once the game is running. We couldn't move, say, just this. Now, I know recently they did some, Cord did some changes to static context where that is possible, but I haven't personally done it, and it's more complicated than I think what we need to go over in this video for now. So as I learn more about that potential, I will make a video on it, but it requires more scripting knowledge and making sure that everything is replicated properly. And so with static context, I can actually hop into another project and kind of give a demonstration on the use case of static context. So let me go ahead and do that real quick. So I went ahead and hopped into another one of our projects called Run 24. This is live on Core. And one of the things in this game, for those of you that don't know, is you run around in this lobby area, and every few minutes or so, a new map will spawn, or a new area will spawn, and players are able to teleport to that new area, and it's a race. And so because of the races, there's a lot of objects in that template that we need to spawn in. And so what we had set up, if I can remember what they were called real quick, here they are. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and drag our racetrack into the world. Okay, so when the game is actually running, this is actually a good example of several contexts altogether. I'm just trying to clean this up real quick to make this easier. Okay, so when we spawn an actual map or a new racetrack for the players to go to, there's various different types of contexts that we need. One of them is the main group needs to be networked, and inside of that we have the static context. And so this entire racetrack, all these objects are under static context. And so even though the static context is under another group that's networked, it allows us to really cut back on the networked properties or the networking of the server when a map is spawned in, because all of this is spawned in static context. And the reason we're not using client is because we do need collision, because it's a map. If we did this in client, the players would be able to visually see the map, but they would fall right through because the client doesn't register collision. And so what we did here is we set it up where the actual map was static context. But because we're spawning these in, we also need to have the parent networked. And then by having a parent, we can then also have triggers and various other things that do require to be networked that are outside of the static context. So these are these other, like this finish trigger here, which is the actual trigger that when the players hit this, that means that they finish the race. This needs to be networked because it needs to be replicated and fire an event. And so this particular trigger we couldn't put in static context because, once again, the server, if you put something under static context, the server doesn't care about the children. It only cares about the parent. And so in that case, we had to have the trigger outside of static context. But overall, because of how the template is set up, it's really only 5 networked objects. While if we took all of these and took it out of static context, this entire map would be several hundred potentially networked objects. And so that's how we are spawning in various different maps or various different races. So let me actually show one more example, because I believe we have, yeah, these series 2 maps. Here we go. So this one's even a little bit more, no, not this one. Maybe this one. And just a shout out, all of these maps were made by Mucusinator. For those of you that don't know or haven't seen it yet, he has a great YouTube channel called Arkpoint. I'll go ahead and link it in the description down below. He's the one that does all the art for all of our projects. I do the coding for the most part. And so with these new types of tracks, you can see that we have a little bit more stuff going on. And once again, we're still using static context for the majority of the geometry of the map. And we have other types of really, there's a few of these that are incorrect. So for example, like the music and stuff like that, this really should be client context. But for now, you know, this was made a while ago and I've learned more since the creation of this. But at the time, this was pretty cool to kind of figure this out. So within the map, we have all these hoops. And so the hoops actually each have an individual trigger. If we go ahead and do this, you can see that the player, when they hit this trigger, they'll get some sort of resource in the game. And I believe it's XP in this case. No, in this case, we actually did have all these networked. So let me take a step back. So on this map, all of these are networked, meaning if one player were to hit this hoop, another player would see it disappear. So the hoops disappear when the trigger is hit by a player. On another map, I believe we had it on client, where when the client, so each individual player would be allowed to collect each hoop. And so you can see that we have a lot of different contexts set up in this. But even with this, because once again, the static context, we've really cut back on network properties, or networking rather. I keep saying that. So we also have a client context here, so I believe some stuff spawns in when the map is created or spawned in as well. You can also put stuff, you can also spawn client context objects under a client context without having those objects networked. And so, yeah, I'm kind of getting all over the place, but the gist of it is that by understanding these different types of contexts and their different use cases, you can really cut back on the networking of your project. So for the most part, you can probably, especially when you're new, you can get away with having the majority of your stuff in just normal context. And when you're just learning, if you need to move any object in the game through script or something like that, and you make it networked, that is a good way to learn, you know, how to move objects and all that stuff. But just be aware that there is other types of context that you'll need to learn going forward if you really want to make a performant game. And so hopefully this video was helpful. It was kind of off the cuff, and you know, this is something that is a bit more complicated. So if I fully didn't make sense or you have questions, please leave them in the comments down below, and I will try and answer those questions, because this is, you know, understanding proper context is extremely important, but it's also, it took me a while to kind of figure out. And like I said, I'm still learning. There's more advanced ways to do stuff within static context as a primary thing to really cut back on networking that I fully don't grasp yet. So as I get better, or understand more, I should say, I will try and make more advanced videos in the future showing, you know, the latest and greatest that I've, you know, stumbled across or learned. So once again, hopefully this video was helpful. And once again, if you have any questions or comments, please do so in the comments down below. If you liked this video and would like to see more correlated content, please hit that thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And I will catch you next time, Titans.